So second in our series, we had Pastor Chris talking a couple of months ago, wasn't it now, about out of Daniel 9. We'll recap that a little bit in a second. But why do we do this? 1/3 of the Bible, round about, maybe a third, maybe 3/4 is regarded as prophecy. In other words, they are statements by people about things that are going to happen in the future, either immediately or maybe in long term. So there's sort of three main themes with prophecy in the word. There's a lot of prophets that are about judgment on Israel and Judah because they weren't doing the right thing. They were going against the God and they just weren't behaving as they should have. So there's a lot of prophecies about that, and it led Israel to going to Assyria and Babylon and so on. There's a lot of prophecies about Christ's birth in Psalms and Isaiah and the minor prophets. And then there's also prophecies about all of time and the end of times. So depending on how you count, maybe 80% of those prophecies have been fulfilled. Which means that there's a little bit to come. And we'll get onto them in the future, I guess, a little bit. So we can see these prophecies that have already occurred. Does that work? Yes. So this is a pretty famous cylinder. It was unearthed in Babylon. And this is a record of Cyrus and how he defeated Babylon. You can read that, can't you? And then over in Rome, there's the Arch of Titus, which is just near the Colosseum. And on the inside of that is this engraving, or whatever you might call it, sculpture, I guess, which is of Titus when he captured Jerusalem in AD 70. And so people like making mementos of their victories, hey. The book of Daniel, just 12 chapters, is really quite a linchpin for prophecy in the Word of God. It connects the Old and New Testaments. There's a lot of references. Jesus makes references to Daniel, the prophecies in Daniel, and there's connections to Revelations as well. Of course, the book has got some really well-known stories. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. And lots of prophecy. And by one count, there's 166 predictions in Daniel of different things and different events and so on. And some of the chapters were written in Aramaic. We'll start with one in a minute, but the rest in Hebrew. So Aramaic was the language of Babylon. It was the language of education and the commercial language at the time, but the rest was in Hebrew. There's kind of two halves to the book. So the first half is talking about Daniel, obviously, in Babylon, in the city of Babylon. They'd just overtaken Judah. Daniel makes a stand in chapter 1. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and so on, they make a stand by not eating the king's food. So these young men, Daniel was probably a teenager at the time, in fact, these young men took a stand that they knew what was right and what was wrong. They'd been taken away to Babylon as punishment, punishment of the whole nation for its transgressions, but they stayed faithful to God. So they stood up and they survived, and even more became important, really important in the nation of Babylon. There's two images of a man, and there's two kings disciplined. One is restored, Nebuchadnezzar, the other one executed. That's Belshazzar, one of Nebuchadnezzar. It's probably a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. And then, of course, at the end of chapter 5 is the end of Babylon's empire. And that's kind of mirrored in the second half of the book as well. We've got Medo-Persia capturing Babylon instead of Babylon capturing Judah. Daniel Daniel particularly makes a stand against the king and the expectation that everyone would pray to the king instead of God. And because of that, he got thrown in the lion's den. So he stayed important, but then there's two visions of animals and prophecies get expounded, and we'll see that it comes to the end of all time. What's in Daniel? The book of Daniel. It starts about 600 BC. So it's got stories of the time, Daniel and his mates standing up. It's got the fiery furnace for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's got a prophecy for a king who went mad and then came to his senses, Nebuchadnezzar. He came to his senses both physically, he stopped being mad, but also spiritually. He recognised Daniel's God as being the one true God. And of course, there's the story of the writing on the wall. So they're the sort of simple stories. They're the comprehensible stories, if you like, from Daniel. But then it's also got the prophecy. And it's got prophecy for those times. There's a prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar's madness and his downfall, about the Jews returning to Jerusalem. It's around those times, the 70 weeks of prophecies, the near time, and then the whole of time. So there's quite a few prophecies, major ones within Daniel. So who was Daniel? He was a man of noble birth, apparently, related in some way to the king of Judah. He was taken, as I said, when he was a young man. He never went back to Jerusalem. So he died in Babylon as an old man, probably over 80. The Jews those that had returned or were returning to Jerusalem had started to doing so by the time he was an old man, the 70 years that we'll come to in a sec, we'll talk about, which Pastor Chris talked about last time. But he recognised that the judgment on Israel was a result of God not being happy with the nation. So he understood that it was a just punishment. He was the only man, Daniel was the only man who essentially administered two empires. So he was good mates, he became good mates with Nebuchadnezzar, the king Nebuchadnezzar, who was quite a tyrant. But his reputation was for wisdom and for governance was second to none. So he rose up through the ranks, a bit like Joseph as well in Egypt before. So he was that for the Babylonians and then very quickly became that for Darius, the Medo-Persian Empire that took over Babylon. We know that he prayed daily and fasted often. We can sometimes find ourselves keeping our faith to ourselves, hey? But Daniel didn't. And standing up for his faith meant that he had to refuse to do things. It was against his religion and even on pain of death. But as a consequence of standing on God and being supported by God, he got a reputation for being in touch with the real God, with the only God. So just a quick recap of the last of the talk, of Pastor Chris's talk. He spoke out of Daniel 9 on 70 years and 70 weeks. The 70 years prophecy is not actually Daniel's, it's Jeremiah's. But Daniel was reading Jeremiah and became aware of it at the beginning of chapter 9 there, and he prayed quite the prayer to God, having read about the 70 years that Israel was going to be punished in Babylon. And it's quite the prayer that he prayed about recognising Judah's transgressions and God's justness in what he was doing to the nation. So, I mean, I guess you can look at that and, like me, you get sort of bedazzled by all the numbers, but they're not what's important. What's important are really the periods between. And so the 70 years prophecy, particularly from Jeremiah, was talking about how the nation of Judah would be out of Jerusalem, would be punished for 70 years. And so there's two periods of 70 years that you can see from when they were first captured until there was an edict to return. That was 70 years. And there was another 70-year period between when the temple was destroyed a few years later to when the temple was rebuilt. Then you've got his 70-week prophecy, which Pastor Chris went through, and that started really when the Babylonian Empire were taken over by the Medes and Persians, and pretty soon Darius and Cyrus announced Jews could return to Jerusalem. And so there were decrees to rebuild. There was 70 weeks of years, so 490 years all up. And it's really quite accurate. There's the first 7 weeks, the first 49 years between the decree to rebuild and Jerusalem being rebuilt and repopulated and the sacrifices happening again there. And there's 62 weeks until Christ is baptized. And then it specifically says in that 70-week prophecy, Christ would die halfway through, or the lamb would be sacrificed halfway through that period, which he was in 3.5 years after he started his ministry. There was also this one from Pastor Russell Gay, which is another showing of the 70 years. It's fascinating. He picked up the point that, so if you measure 483 solar years, you get these differences between there was an edict to return and Christ's baptism. If you count it in lunar years are a little bit smaller because it's the time for the moon to go around. It's only 354 days for the moon to go around the Earth 12 times. And that actually hits the year that John the Baptist started his ministry. So it's quite fascinating. So let's go to the particular prophecy I want to cover tonight, which is the whole of time, Daniel chapter 2. I'm not going to read all of it, just bits and pieces. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. And the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, "I've had a dream. My spirit is anxious to know what I was dreaming about." We've all had that experience, haven't we? We know we've dreamt, but we can't remember. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation." The king answered and said to them, "My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces. Your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honour. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation." Sounds a bit tough, doesn't it? Down to verse 11. "It is a difficult thing," they said, "that the king requests. There is no one other who can tell the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh." Our gods don't know this stuff, is what they're saying. And in verse 12, "For this reason the king was angry and very furious. He gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. They sought Daniel and his companions to kill them." So serious times. Like I said, Nebuchadnezzar was a tough guy. But Daniel heard about it. Verse 14, "Then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, had been sent to do this. 'Why is the decree from the king so urgent?' Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went. He asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Brave man. And Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's the Hebrew names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision, and so Daniel blessed the God of heaven." Down to verse 26, he goes to the king. He's got the revelation for him, and the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, that's his Babylonian name, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, The astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. Verse 28. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Then in verse 31, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendour was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of clay and partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. The stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, says Daniel. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. So then in verse 37, you, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand. He has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. Verse 39, but after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another. A third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And then the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. So Rome was going to rule for a day, so that it was identified with Rome. Then whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom should be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw the iron mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. So the fourth kingdom, the Roman kingdom, was going to split and rack and break apart and shatter in some way. And then in these days, the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So there's going to be 4 empires that were just being talked about, but then there's going to be empire that's going to last forever. It shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all those kingdoms. It shall stand forever. And obviously we can recognise that already as being the kingdom of God and Christ ushering it in. Verse 45, inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain. Its interpretation is sure. Then verse 48, the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So in 600 BC, God knows already what the major empires of civilization are going to be. And finally, he says and asserts that a rock is going to come that will replace all of man's efforts. And this understanding of this prophecy has been around for quite a while. This is a statement from a guy from AD 200, Hippolytus. The golden head of the image and lioness denoted the Babylonians. The shoulder and arm of silver and the bear represented the Persians and the Medes, modern-day Iran, as a matter of interest. The belly and thighs of brass, the leopard, meant the Greeks, who held the sovereignty from Alexander's time. The legs of iron and the beast, dreadful and terrible, expressed the Romans, who hold sovereignty at present. So these kingdoms are yet to arise, and finally Christ will come. So here we go with a bit of a timeline of those kingdoms. We've got Babylon that were overtaken by the Medes and Persians about the 500s and mid-500s. And then they were in turn overtaken by the Greeks, Alexander the Great, and then by Rome. And Rome lasted for quite a while. So just Christ was born during the period of the first Caesar. So that's one way to look at it. And then there's another prophecy in chapter 7, which very much aligns with the prophecy from chapter 2. But the imagery in this one is of beasts. So we've got the winged lion, which is Babylon. We've got the bear, which is Medo-Persia. We've got the leopard, which is Greece. And we've got Rome, which is just a horrible looking beast. In chapter 8, it seems to focus on two of those empires, the Medo-Persian Empire, which was this time represented as the ram, and the he-goat, which represented Greece. And it has sort of all these kind of descriptions in here. Some of the fascinating points for me about chapter 8, that the he-goat, Greece, is described as moving quickly from the west, but is broken at the height of its power. And that's a great description of Alexander the Great, if you know your history. He took over. There's never been a general that took over as much land so quickly as Alexander the Great. But then he was dead by when he was 32. It then talks about 4 horns coming out of that, and we see that there are 4 Greek generals that ruled the different parts of the Greek Empire at that point, of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. And then right verse 14 of this chapter talks about 2,300 years later, the sanctuary will be put right again. So it talks about this 2,300 years from the Greek Empire, and after Greek conquered the Medo-Persians in 331 BC, and you add 2,300, you get to 1917. What happened in 1917? That was the re-establishment of the State of Israel. It was the Balfour Declaration, and the freeing of Jerusalem from the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, during the First World War. Chapter 7 and chapter 8 are different mirrors, if you like, of chapter 2. And there's a whole lot more little bits and pieces in those 2 chapters, and you can really identify some of the individuals that had power during that time as well. But there's only one empire remaining, and of course that's the Rock. And it's fascinating. I didn't really appreciate this until I was looking at all of the stuff for this talk. That Jesus Christ, he appears in history at the beginning of the Roman Empire, of the Fourth Empire, and in fact in the middle of the reign of the first emperor. But then his second coming is going to be at the absolute end of this Fourth Empire, which is going to start as legs of iron, break into feet of iron and clay, and then be smashed by the Rock. So that's quite a significant understanding there. And so when we then move into Revelations in the New Testament, we can see that as being the history of the New Testament age. We've been through that a little bit. We'll do that again as part of this series. So you've got the kingdom of iron, this 4th kingdom of iron being the whole age of the basically 2,000 years. It's the same as the gospel age, when the gospel is made known to everyone. And then there's the seals that we see from Revelation. The seals, the trumpets, and the vials. And then finally, the Rock. So there's this wonderful connection between Daniel and Revelations via the beasts in Daniel chapter 7 and the beasts of Revelations as well. But finally, we get the stone that's going to take over the earth, that breaks all other kingdoms to dust. It takes the beast of Rome, and all of man's endeavours will become subject to the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So why is prophecy important for me? Well, we can't always be specific about exact dates and exact relationships, but there's some really important and clear prophecies like Daniel chapter 2 that go through the ages. For me, prophecy is important because it shows that God's in control even when it doesn't look like he is. And God's in control now, even though we wonder what's going on with the wars and so on. For me, it also validates the Bible as being authentic and reliable. These prophecies are so accurate and so clear, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can see quite a few of them. We can really take comfort and trust in what's going to happen as well. It describes what's coming for mankind. This rock that is going to break apart man's efforts at government, and it's going to take over. And then we align that as well with the pictures that we get at the end of Revelations. We can see that there's still 20% maybe of the prophecies in the Word of God to come to pass. And we are living right in the middle of that time. As I've said to a few people since our last birthdays, I never believed I'd reach 70. But here we are. And the Lord is still in control. So it emphasizes to me that Christ is going to return. So get ready and stay ready. And be like Daniel. Be prayerful. Spend time with fasting. And never neglect the company of saints. And trust the Bible. Amen.